Between March 19, 1847 and September 14, 1853, 14 altar boys vanished without a trace from St. Joseph's Catholic Church in rural Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. Not one body was ever found, and no credible witness ever came forward. The church records documenting those years were mysteriously destroyed in a fire that left every other document in the rectory untouched, suggesting deliberate erasure rather than accidental loss. 3 weeks ago, during renovation work at the old Sacred Heart Municipal Building, a lead line box was uncovered buried beneath the foundation. Inside were 127 pages of handwritten testimony, sealed church correspondence, and photographs that the Diocese of Pittsburgh had ordered destroyed in 1854. These documents revealed that the disappearances were not random tragedies or runaway children, but part of a calculated, systematic operation that turned the church, a house of God, into a hunting ground, and the community's most trusted figure into its greatest threat. Survivors who broke their silence after more than 170 years described rituals disguised as prayer sessions. Children who returned from private meetings were fundamentally changed, silent, and withdrawn. The testimonies told a sophisticated psychological manipulation so powerful that parents willingly delivered their sons into the hands of a predator without suspicion. The parents' silence was enforced by fear of excommunication and social banishment, backed by threats from church authorities. Those who dared to speak faced eternal damnation, according to the official church punishments documented in the recovered pages. This was not mere superstition. It was a system designed to silence and conceal. But this was not an isolated case. The pattern of disappearances, the rituals described, and the secrecy closely matched similar incidents spanning neighboring counties, and even states like Ohio and West Virginia. What seemed like a local horror was part of a vast network of systematic abuse stretching over decades and across regions. The photographs found in the box depicted group rituals, symbols drawn in ash, and haunting images of the missing boys. Some photos were partially burned or blurred, but their message was clear. One photo showed the altar covered in cryptic symbols with a handwritten caption stating, "They were offered, not lost." The church's attempts to cover up these crimes were thorough and ruthless. An official letter, signed by the bishop at the time, ordered the destruction of all records and forbade any further discussion of the matter. Yet, the truth survived, sealed away beneath concrete for generations, waiting to be uncovered. Today, the full scope of the horror is coming to light. The long-buried testimonies, the sealed threats, the chilling photographs, all reveal a story of betrayal, silence, and evil hidden behind the walls of a sacred place. This is the account the church tried to bury, the voices they tried to silence, and the dark truth of what happened to the boys of St. Joseph's Catholic Church. All right, listen up. What I'm about to tell you will blow your mind and might even freak you out. But before we dive in, smash that subscribe button and drop a comment with the state you're watching from. Because not many channels have the guts to reveal the dark secrets we're uncovering today. And this story, it'll test even the toughest nerves. It all starts back in 1845, in the hills of western Pennsylvania, a rough patch of land where Irish immigrants, desperate and hopeful, were trying to rebuild their lives after fleeing the potato famine. Imagine a tiny place called Sacred Heart. Not even a town, just a few wooden houses huddled around one building that meant everything to these people, St. Joseph's Catholic Church. This church wasn't just a building. It was their fortress of faith, perched on a small hill overlooking Mill Creek, its bell tower visible for miles across the rolling hills. The community was tiny, just 312 souls, who scraped together every last penny to build this sanctuary. They hauled stones from nearby quarries and cut timber from the surrounding forests. Most men worked backbreaking jobs in coal mines or the steel mills of Pittsburgh, 2 grueling days away on horseback. But despite their struggles, their Catholic faith was their shield against the harsh, often hostile world they lived in. Then came Father Cornelius Ollie. On a cold, rain-soaked Tuesday in October 1845, this man showed up, and to the people's Sacred Heart, he was an answer prayers they'd almost given up on. At 38, Father Ollie was tall, 6 feet, with piercing blue eyes and silver hair that gave him an air of authority. He carried himself with the kind of presence that made even the toughest men look away respectfully, and mothers instantly trusted him with their children. He spoke with the refined accent of a Dublin seminary graduate, but understood the hard lives of these working-class immigrants. He told stories of serving parishes in Boston and Baltimore, backed by letters from powerful bishops known all across Catholic America. The last priest, Father McKenna, had died suddenly just a month earlier, found peacefully in his garden with no warning. The parish had been left without guidance, and their pleas for a replacement seemed to vanish into a bureaucratic black hole in Philadelphia. Then, almost like fate, Father Ollie arrived, with official documents sealed by Bishop Francis Kenrich himself. But here's where things start to get dark. Behind Father Ollie's charming smile and confident words, something sinister was lurking, something that would turn this small town's faith into fear, and their church into a hunting ground. Between March 19th, 1847 and September 14th, 1853, a little over 6 years, 14 altar boys simply vanished. No bodies, no witnesses, nothing. Just gone. And the church records from those years burned to ashes in a fire that weirdly left every other document in the rectory untouched. That's not a coincidence. That's deliberate erasure. Fast forward to 3 weeks ago. Renovations at the old Sacred Heart Municipal Building uncovered a lead-lined box buried beneath the foundation. Inside, 127 pages of handwritten testimony, sealed church correspondence, and photographs, all ordered destroyed by the Diocese of Pittsburgh in 1854. What these documents reveal is chilling beyond belief. These disappearances weren't accidents. They weren't runaway kids. This was a carefully planned operation, a dark secret hidden beneath the church's holy walls. The most trusted man in the community became their greatest threat. Survivors, yes, survivors who broke a silence lasting over 170 years, describe what they endured. Rituals disguised as prayer. Boys returning from private sessions, utterly changed, silent, scared, broken. The documents reveal psychological manipulation so sophisticated, so terrifying, that parents handed their children over willingly, blinded by faith and fear. The church didn't just cover this up. They weaponized faith to silence anyone who questioned it. Excommunication loomed like a sword over any who dared speak, cutting off families from their community and condemning them to social death. But this nightmare was bigger than just one church or one town. The pattern matched disappearances and similar dark stories in neighboring counties and states. Ohio, West Virginia, revealing a network of horrors spreading across decades and miles. The photos found in that box are haunting, faded but undeniable. Boys in ritualistic settings, cryptic symbols scrawled on altar stones, and a church altar stained not with wine but with something far darker. One photo bore a chilling caption: "They were offered, not lost." The church's response? Ruthless. A letter signed by the bishop ordered all records destroyed, and any talk of these events strictly forbidden. Yet, the truth survived, hidden beneath concrete and silence for generations, waiting to explode into the light. Now the full story is out. The long-hidden testimonies, the silenced voices, the damning photographs, all finally exposing betrayal and evil that lived behind the sacred walls of St. Joseph's. This isn't just history. It's a warning. And it's a reminder that sometimes the monsters hiding in the shadows were the faces we trust the most. If you're brave enough to face this darkness with me, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this story. Because some truths are worth uncovering, no matter how terrifying. Imagine a small town where faith was everything, and one man turned that devotion into something unthinkable. This is a true story of how a single priest transformed a peaceful community and almost got away with something horrifying. It all started with a document, a letter sealed, stamped, and signed by Bishop Francis Kenrich himself, authorizing the assignment of a mysterious priest to a forgotten town in western Pennsylvania. That priest? Father Cornelius Ollie. And within weeks of his arrival at St. Joseph's, everything changed. Ollie didn't just preach, he performed. His sermons weren't just homilies, they were events. Families from towns miles away packed into Sacred Heart to hear his thunderous Latin chants and flawless doctrine. He knew every law, every passage, every saint. He made religion feel like destiny. But what really won people over wasn't his sermons. It was what he did for the children. Father Ollie built what seemed like a path to heaven for Sacred Heart's boys, a proper altar boy program. Before this, the elderly Father McKenna had barely kept things afloat. But now, Ollie was hand-picking boys to train in the deepest mysteries of faith. And for the struggling families of Sacred Heart, most of them Irish immigrants who worked brutal jobs in coal mines and steel mills, this was a dream come true. Their sons were being given purpose, education, a shot at something bigger. Parents competed to have their boys selected. Being an altar boy under Ollie was like winning the golden ticket. Michael Flanagan, the baker's son who couldn't read a year ago, he was now fluent in Latin. Tommy Sullivan, just 10, could hold his own discussing theology with visiting clergy. And Patrick Donnelly, the blacksmith's eldest, told his parents he was ready to dedicate his life to God because of Father Ollie. But Ollie didn't stop at sermons and ceremonies. He beautified the church with stained glass windows of Irish saints, Bridget Columba Patrick, whose struggles mirrored the town's own. He raised funds for ornate brass candlesticks. He added a massive bronze bell that echoed through the hills, calling the faithful with what sounded like a voice from heaven. This wasn't just spiritual revival. It was transformation. But underneath the hymns, the stained glass, and the polished sermons, something dark was brewing, because it was in his private sessions with the altar boys that Ollie seemed most invested. He told parents the boys needed to train away from distractions. In the basement, where sacred relics were stored, where rituals could be practiced in quiet. And that made sense, right? After all, Ollie was a perfectionist, a man of great discipline and spiritual precision. But that's when parents began to notice changes. Their sons started speaking differently. Their childhood chatter faded. Their joy dimmed. They weren't talking about games or school anymore. They were talking about obedience, sacrifice, calling. They became serious, silent, obedient. Some called it maturity. Others whispered that it was something else. The boys grew attached, not just each other, but to Ollie. They clung to him with the loyalty of disciples. They revered him, feared him, followed him without question. And the town applauded. They saw their sons walking straighter, speaking wiser, acting holier. They believed their children were blessed. They had no idea what was really happening in the darkness below their feet, because what they thought was a priest preparing boys for priesthood was actually the beginning of something much, much darker. And it was only just getting started. Father Ollie wasn't just building a ministry. He was building something deeper, something secret, a brotherhood. He called it sacred, holy, a spiritual elevation that lifted his chosen altar boys above the ordinary, above the mundane world of chores, games, and childhood. And the boys believed him, especially young Tommy Sullivan. His mother, Mary, beamed with pride at how her son had changed. Just a year ago, Tommy was all scraped knees and frog-catching adventures down by Mill Creek. But now he quoted scripture. He spoke of the Eucharist like it was fire and light, like he had tasted divinity itself. And when Mary asked about the special training he received from Father Ollie, Tommy's eyes would glaze over, as if staring into something too holy for words. "They're sacred secrets, Mama," he whispered. "Only the Brotherhood can know." At first, that just sounded like devotion. But behind those whispered prayers and midnight confessions was something much darker. No one realized that this man, the priest they trusted with their children, was carefully, methodically grooming them. Their faith wasn't protecting them. It was a trap. And Father Ollie? He was a predator. He used religion like a scalpel, precise, silent, deadly, slicing trust from truth and turning devotion into a weapon. He wasn't preparing these boys for heaven. He was preparing them for something else entirely. The harvest was coming. And it began on March 19th, 1847, the Feast of St. Joseph. It was supposed to be a celebration, one of the most important days on the Catholic calendar. The frost still sparkled on rooftops. The hills of western Pennsylvania stood silent and cold beneath a perfect blue sky. Inside the tiny homes of Sacred Heart, families dressed in their best. Candles flickered. Kitchens filled with the smell of soda bread and smoked bacon. The bell tower rang out across the valley, strong, holy, familiar, but no one knew it was tolling for the beginning of a nightmare. 12-year-old Michael Flanagan had been chosen for the honor of leading the dawn mass. He was the most trusted altar boy, serious, humble, devoted. His mother, Bridge, ironed his white surplice until it shone like snow. She watched from the window as he walked to church, prayer book pressed to his chest, breath fogging in the morning air. He never missed Mass. He never missed a meal. He never forgot his chores. So when 2 hours passed, then 3, then 4, Bridge knew something was wrong. Terribly, horribly wrong. She rushed to the church expecting to find her son lighting candles or folding linens in the sacristy. But the chapel was silent. No Michael. No Ollie. No trace. That was the last time anyone would ever see Michael Flanagan alive. And that morning was only the beginning. The moment Michael Flanagan vanished, Sacred Heart changed forever, and the clock started ticking. It was supposed to be the most sacred day of the year, the Feast of St. Joseph. The town had prepared for weeks. But when Michael, the most devout altar boy in the village, didn't show up for the noon mass, panic began to ripple. His mother rushed to the church, expecting to find him quietly helping Father Ollie with last-minute preparations. But when she entered the chapel, it was empty, except for one woman, Catherine Morrison, adjusting daffodils on the altar. "Oh, Father Ollie left hours ago," she said casually. "Said he had business in Pittsburgh." Wait, what? That didn't make sense. Michael would never just leave, especially not without telling his family. And Father Ollie, he hadn't said anything about leaving town. Confusion turned to fear. Within the hour, the entire town mobilized. The feast day celebrations were canceled. Men grabbed lanterns and rifles and spread out across the hills, calling Michael's name until their voices cracked. They dragged the creek, searched the forest, combed through abandoned mine shafts. Nothing. No footprints. No clothing. No body. Just silence. Then, just as the sun began to dip behind the trees, Father Ollie returned. His horse was soaked in sweat, his cassock dusty, his face grim. He told the town he had gone to Pittsburgh, met with the bishop, talked about expanding the altar boy program to other parishes. He even said the bishop wanted to use Sacred Heart as a model. And when they told him about Michael, Ollie looked devastated. He prayed with the family. He organized extra search teams. He held vigils. He did everything a good priest was supposed to do. But after 3 days with no sign of the boy, Ollie called for a town meeting. And what he said that night would change everything. The church was packed. Hundreds of worried parents and neighbors squeezed into the wooden pews, the glow of votive candles casting flickering shadows on the walls. Father Ollie stood at the front, black cassock flowing, silver hair glinting in the candlelight. He looked like a prophet, and he spoke like one too. "My dear brothers and sisters in Christ," he began, his Dublin accent rolling like thunder through the chapel. "We are gathered tonight in deep sorrow. Young Michael Flanagan is gone, and though we have searched with all our might, we have found no trace of him in this world." A wave of shivers ran through the room, and then Ollie dropped a bombshell. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a whisper, forcing the crowd to go silent. "Michael came to me," he said, just days before the feast. "Confessed something terrible, a sin so grave he feared for his soul." The crowd held its breath. He was stealing communion wine, Ollie said, giving it to Protestant boys from the next town. Gasps echoed off the stone walls. He taught them to mock the Mass, to parody our most sacred rites. Michael's parents froze, their faces a mix of shock and confusion. That didn't sound like their son. But Ollie wasn't finished. "I gave him penance," he continued. "I told him to spend the vigil night in prayer, alone in the church, to ask for forgiveness. When I left for Pittsburgh, I believed he would stay, but I fear his shame overcame him." Ollie's voice cracked with emotion. "I believe Michael fled, ran to the city to escape judgment. Or worse, sought refuge with those who led him astray. And just like that, the narrative changed. Michael wasn't a victim. He was a runaway, a fallen soul, a boy who had turned his back on the church. And who would question the priest's word? Who would dig deeper into the disappearance of a child that had, allegedly, betrayed the very faith his community lived by? Father Ali's story worked perfectly, until one person refused to accept it. Margaret O'Brien, the church's cleaner, the woman who knew every floorboard and cobweb in the building, had seen something. Something no one else noticed. That morning, as she prepared for the feast, she'd found Michael's prayer book on the floor of the sacristy, abandoned, its leather cover stained with something dark. And it wasn't wine. When Margaret O'Brien opened the sacristy that morning, she expected peace. Instead, she stepped into a nightmare. Michael Flanagan had vanished without a trace. But inside the church, his prayer book lay abandoned on the floor, its leather stained, not with wine, not with wax, but with something thick, something dark. And that was just the beginning. The altar candles burned down to waxy nubs, like they'd been lit and relit over and over again. And the wax trails? Not random. They spiraled in strange, deliberate shapes across the floor. Then came the final sign, the one that made Margaret's skin crawl. The basement door was open, and it had never been opened before. Father McKenna, the previous priest, had always kept it locked, said it was unsafe, too damp, too unstable. But now, it stood slightly ajar, like someone or something had gone down and didn't come back up. Margaret hesitated, then descended. What she remembered from years ago was a dusty storage chamber with a dirt floor. Harmless, forgotten, but not now, not today. The moment she stepped onto the stairs, a wave of scent hit her, like a fist to the gut, rotting sweetness. Incense mixed with something dead. She turned back immediately. She couldn't breathe, and when she told Father O'Malley, everything changed. His eyes, once warm and full of fatherly charm, turned cold and calculating, ice blue, unblinking. "Margaret," he said softly, almost kindly, "grief plays tricks on the mind. Tragedy makes people imagine things." She stammered about the basement, the smell, the prayer book, the open door, but O'Malley didn't flinch. His voice dropped into a terrifying calm. "Those relics require incense, sacred rituals, special handling. You may have misunderstood what you saw." "And Margaret," he said, stepping close, towering over her, "gossip is the devil's tool. I'd hate to see you used by him." She backed away, heart pounding. The message was clear. Stay silent. Or else. But Margaret was no fool. She kept cleaning the church, yes, but now she carried a hidden notebook. She wrote everything down. The candle wax, the noises, the stains, the inconsistencies, one detail at a time. And as she recorded, a horrifying pattern began to emerge. 1 week later, the official search for Michael Flanagan was called off. His parents kept hoping, but no one else believed. Father O'Malley held a memorial mass. He even started a fund in Michael's name, using the money to expand the altar boy training program. More books, more relics, and more sessions in the church basement. To the outside world, life in Sacred Heart returned to normal. But underground, the unthinkable was happening. Because Michael Flanagan hadn't run away. He hadn't fallen through ice. He hadn't joined Protestant boys in rebellion. He was still there. His body lay beneath the very church he had served, in a chamber that no parent had ever seen, buried alongside evidence of rituals so horrific, so vile, they would have shattered the minds of everyone in Sacred Heart. And above that cursed tomb, Father O'Malley was already choosing his next victim. The altar boy program expanded. More boys were selected. Parents celebrated. They trusted O'Malley, worshipped him, delivered their sons into his care like lambs to a shepherd, never imagining they were placing them at the feet of a predator. The changes came slowly. O'Malley's sermons grew darker. He spoke of sin, punishment, and obedience. He warned of spiritual warfare. "The devil is cunning," he would preach, pacing before the altar, "and he targets the purest, especially those who serve at God's altar." He made it sound noble, like their children were warriors in a holy battle. But behind the words, control. O'Malley told them the altar boys needed special protection, private training, blessed spaces. That meant one thing: solo sessions in the basement. No more group lessons. No more parents watching from the pews. Just a child and O'Malley in the sanctified darkness below. And still, no one questioned it. Because who would question God's chosen? The boys came back changed. They were quieter, more obedient. Some were solemn, others fearful. But they all said the same thing. They were being trained. They were being tested. They were becoming holy. And their parents believed them. Because if they didn't, they had to face the possibility that their beloved priest, their spiritual leader, the man who had guided them through famine, immigration, and hardship, was not a servant of God, but something else entirely. And Margaret, she kept writing, because deep down she knew Michael hadn't been the first, and he wouldn't be the last. Everything looked normal. In fact, it looked better than ever. Tommy Sullivan, just 11 years old, was now the most senior altar boy. His voice echoed Latin prayers with perfect pitch. He spoke theology like a miniature scholar, and visiting priests said he had the soul of a saint. But something about Tommy's transformation felt too perfect. And that's when Kathleen Murphy started to worry. Her 13-year-old son, Danny, had just joined the altar boy program. At first, she was proud, elated even. But then, Danny changed. The happy, talkative boy who once rattled off every detail of his day during dinner? Gone. In his place was a quiet, distant shadow of himself. When she asked what happened during his sessions with Father O'Malley, he gave vague answers. Sacred mysteries. Special prayers. Things I'm not allowed to say. And the more Kathleen watched, the more she felt something was wrong. Danny was eating normally, but he was losing weight. Dark circles bloomed beneath his eyes like bruises from sleepless nights. His hands started to tremble, just slightly, especially when someone mentioned O'Malley. She asked, "Are you sick?" He smiled. "I'm fine." But the smile didn't reach his eyes. Then came the knowledge. Danny began talking about obscure Catholic doctrines no one taught at their small parish. He referenced ancient rituals, foreign belief systems, Latin prayers Kathleen had never heard in church. And when she asked where he learned all this, Father O'Malley says we're learning about the true church before it was corrupted. That phrase lodged in her chest like a shard of ice. And then the nightmares began. Screams in the middle of the night. Danny thrashing in bed, crying out for someone to stop the man in the shadows, who wasn't really Father O'Malley. When she tried to get him to explain, all he could say were terrifying fragments. Stone chambers lit by candles burning in unnatural colors. Chanting in languages that hurt his ears. Rituals that left him feeling empty inside. He couldn't explain it fully. He didn't want to, and he wasn't alone. Kathleen started talking to the other altar boy families, and that's when the full picture began to emerge. Timothy Walsh had developed a stutter, but only when he spoke about his church duties. Brian O'Connor, once a ball of energy, now sat for hours in the garden, staring at nothing. And Patrick Donnelly, the boy who once begged to become a priest like Father O'Malley, now flinched whenever the priest walked into the room. So Kathleen did what any mother would do. She spoke up. She tried to talk to the other mothers, the same women she'd known for years, who had once shared every secret, every worry, every dream. But now, they shut her down. "Don't question it," they said. "The boys are maturing. Spiritually. You wouldn't understand." Some even accused her of being jealous. It didn't make sense until she realized. They were scared too. They didn't want to admit anything was wrong. Why? Because Father O'Malley had already anticipated their doubts. He told the families the boys were being trained in advanced spiritual disciplines. Disciplines so powerful they had to remain secret. Speaking about them could ruin the boys' spiritual progress. Worse, it could invite demonic influence. And who wants to be responsible for that? Any parent who loved their child, O'Malley said, would respect the boundaries, trust the church, trust him. But there was more. O'Malley had turned any criticism of the altar boy program into something even more dangerous, a criticism of Catholicism itself. In Sacred Heart, that was unthinkable. Their religion was all they had. They were Irish immigrants, Outsiders in a Protestant land. Their faith wasn't just personal, it was survival. To question O'Malley wasn't just to challenge a priest, it was to challenge everything. And so, despite their instincts, despite their fears, they stayed silent. And then came the second disappearance. Exactly 1 year after Michael Flanagan vanished. On the Feast of St. Joseph, 1848, Tommy Sullivan, golden boy, star acolyte, the pride of the parish, didn't come home. And this time, not even denial could protect him from the truth that was beginning to surface. Everyone thought the nightmare was over, but they were wrong. Because exactly 1 year after Michael Flanagan vanished, another boy disappeared. And this time, the lie was bigger, the manipulation deeper, and the truth almost unbelievable. Tommy Sullivan was the golden altar boy, the pride of Sacred Heart. People worshiped the ground he walked on. And when he suddenly went missing, Father O'Malley didn't panic. He celebrated in front of the entire congregation. During Sunday Mass, O'Malley stood tall before the candlelit altar and made an announcement that stunned the town. Tommy has been chosen for an extraordinary honor. Bishop Kendrick himself, O'Malley claimed, had personally requested Tommy for a secret mission to bring the Catholic faith to the wild western frontier. Ohio, Indiana, dangerous territory dominated by Protestants. The boy was now a missionary, a warrior for God. The people cheered. They cried tears of pride. They wished they were as lucky as the Sullivan family. But one person wasn't clapping, Margaret O'Brien, because she had seen this pattern before. Just like with Michael, she noticed the basement door left open again, and this time, the smell coming up was even worse. Incense and something sour, organic, like decay masked by perfume. And there was more. For weeks before Tommy's departure, O'Malley had been watching him, training him alone, keeping him after the others left, whispering to him during Mass in a way that made Margaret's stomach twist. Then she found it, Tommy's most treasured possession, a wooden cross carved by his dying grandfather during their voyage to America. He never took it off, and yet it was left behind, lying silently in the sacristy the morning after he vanished. No letter, no goodbye, just gone. Margaret was shaking when she showed it to O'Malley. His response? Terrifying. "Oh, he left that behind on purpose," O'Malley said, voice calm and chilling, as a spiritual anchor, to stay connected to Sacred Heart. Then his expression darkened. "And Margaret," he said, stepping closer, "your constant questions, your doubt, they're starting to sound like a spiritual sickness." The air in the church seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Perhaps you need confession, Margaret, before your doubt spreads, before you risk bearing false witness against God's holy work." The message was crystal clear. Stay silent or face destruction. And Margaret, she had no power, no voice. In a town where questioning your priest was like questioning God, she'd be torn apart. So she stayed quiet, but she didn't stop watching. She kept her journal hidden, documenting everything, every strange moment, every ritual, every unsettling change in the boys. And changes were happening fast. As 1848 turned into 1849, O'Malley's grip on the town tightened. He introduced new rituals, secretive, strange, and highly selective. Midnight masses, but only for altar boys. Extended fasts that left them weak and shaking. Private confession sessions that lasted for hours. Afterward, the boys emerged pale, silent, and drained, like something had been taken from them. But the town didn't see the warning signs. They saw miracles. The boys spoke fluent Latin. They quoted scripture like scholars. They preached humility and sacrifice with voices too heavy for their age. And O'Malley, he told them it was proof of divine transformation. He said their sons were being prepared for greatness. And the town, desperate for meaning, for pride, for holiness, believed every word, even when the boys stopped playing outside, even when they stopped talking at dinner, even when they began to flinch at loud noises. They called it spiritual focus. They didn't realize it was trauma. Sacred Heart was now being called a model parish. Bishops from other dioceses visited just to see the altar boy program. There was talk of spreading it across the region. But behind the curtain, it was all a lie. A system built by one man, a predator, who had mastered the art using faith as a weapon. He had twisted everything sacred, every prayer, every ritual, every symbol, into a trap, a disguise. And no one was safe. Not until someone finally had the courage to speak. This wasn't just a priest gone rogue. This was a master manipulator, controlling an entire town. Father O'Malley wasn't just selecting victims. He was grooming an entire community to hand them over willingly, twisting their faith, bending their trust, until they saw abuse as sacrifice and evil as divine destiny. By 1850, the infection had spread. 5 altar boys were gone without a trace. And finally, even Sacred Heart's most devout families started noticing the cracks. O'Malley's stories had gone from inspiring to insane. He told one family their son had been called to a monastery in the Alps. Another was apparently preaching to native tribes in Missouri. One boy, O'Malley claimed, had been so spiritually gifted he had been taken in by angels for divine training. Every story got weirder, and every time the same pattern. Weeks of intense private training in the church basement. Emotional, physical, and spiritual changes in the boy. A final midnight vigil, after which the boy was never seen again. And then, official-looking letters, church seals, stamped blessings, and parents were told to never speak of it again, because questioning it meant you didn't trust God. And if you didn't trust God, maybe your soul was in danger, too. But some people, the brave ones, started to break the silence. It started with Sean O'Connor, whose son Liam had disappeared last fall. Sean used to be a quiet, hard-working coal miner. But now, he was destroyed. Every night, he sat at Murphy's Tavern in Millfield, downing glass after glass of whiskey, whispering things that made people's skin crawl. "They're not prayers," he'd mumble. "It sounds like Latin, but it's wrong. Real wrong. Hurts your ears." He spoke of passing the church at midnight and seeing lights moving behind the basement windows, shadows that didn't match the number of people inside. He heard children's voices, but they weren't singing hymns. They were chanting, repeating words that felt ancient and evil. And the worst part, he said the sound was coming from below the church, deeper than any basement should go. And then came Mary Gallagher, the widow who lived across from St. Joseph's. She couldn't sleep. She never could. But what she saw at night would have driven most people insane. She told her sister that on moonless nights, she saw figures, dressed in white, moving through the cemetery with bundles in their arms. They weren't walking. They were gliding, and their limbs moved wrong, like puppets on invisible strings. They carried those bundles, small bundles, to the mausoleum where Sacred Heart's founders were buried. And then the sound started. Children, crying, but not like they were hurt, like they were lost, trapped somewhere far away, calling out for their mothers. And over all of it, O'Malley's voice, but not the voice they knew, deeper, echoing, inhuman. Mary said she dropped to her knees and prayed until the sun came up. Still, no one listened, not until James McKenna, the nephew of the former priest, found the journal, and it changed everything. Father McKenna, the man O'Malley had replaced, had suspected something. Weeks before he died, McKenna received a letter from Bishop Kendrick's office assigning O'Malley to Sacred Heart. But when he tried to verify it, silence, no response, no confirmation. It was like the letter had been forged. And that wasn't all. O'Malley spoke of strange hybrid rituals, mixing Catholic rites with ideas Father McKenna didn't recognize. They weren't in the Bible. They weren't in Catholic doctrine. They were older, darker. In the final pages of his journal, McKenna's handwriting grew shaky. He wrote about O'Malley's obsession with the church basement. He asked about what kind of stone the building was made from, whether bodies had ever been buried on the grounds. McKenna knew something was deeply wrong. And then he was found dead, peaceful, like he'd just stepped into eternity. But after what we know now, it wasn't peace. It was silenced, and Sacred Heart was living on borrowed time. Because the monster they thought was their savior, was only just getting started? What if the priest you trusted with your child's soul was actually preparing them for something inhuman? This is where things get terrifying. Because just when Sacred Heart thought the worst was behind them, when 5 boys had already vanished and whispers echoed through every pew, Father O'Malley's darkest secrets were only beginning to surface. It all began with a journal. Not just any journal. Father McKenna's final writings. He had once ruled this church with quiet dignity. But in his last days, he was a man afraid, haunted, and when he wrote that something ancient was stirring beneath the church, something waiting for the right hand to awaken it, he knew exactly who that hand belonged to. Father Cornelius O'Malley. O'Malley wasn't just a priest. He was a key to unlock something buried deep in stone beneath their church, beneath their faith. McKenna's last entry? A cry for forgiveness. I fear I've been too weak to stop what's coming. May God forgive me for letting the wolf into our fold. The next morning, McKenna was found dead in his garden. No marks, no wounds, just gone, like a soul who had simply surrendered. Fast forward 4 years. March 1851. Everything was about to explode because Patrick Donnelly, the oldest remaining altar boy, only 16, finally broke. He locked the door, pulled his father close, and said one sentence that shattered everything. They're not dead. His voice shaking, his skin pale as snow. What he said next would expose a nightmare that defied belief. Father O'Malley's private sessions had started normal, teaching Latin, scripture, complex rituals. But then it changed. The boys were taught prayers in languages older than Latin, older than anything Catholic. They were shown symbols that hurt to look at. Patrick said it felt like they twisted in your mind, like they weren't meant for human eyes. He was taught how to breathe differently, how to quiet his heartbeat, not for meditation, but to listen, to hear something underneath. It wasn't just one room. O'Malley had open chambers beneath the basement, places carved out of living rock that didn't exist when Father McKenna was alive. Patrick said the walls were alive with geometry that bent the laws of reality, candles that burned with flames going the wrong direction, shadows that moved before you did. The air? A mix of rotting flowers and sweet decay. But the worst part? Patrick saw the missing boys. All of them, standing there, eyes glowing, faces familiar, but wrong. They moved like they weren't in control, like they were being puppeted by something else. Their voices didn't belong to them anymore. They spoke in unison, dozens of tones layered into one. Patrick called them O'Malley's eternal altar boys. Not dead, not alive, something worse. They're still here, Patrick whispered, hands trembling. They serve him now. He says I'm next. His father, James Donnelly, a man who'd survived starvation, disease, and building a life from ashes, stood at a crossroad. Believe his son? Or deny everything he thought he knew about his priest, his church, and his God? It wasn't just about Patrick anymore. If Patrick was right, then their entire community had been worshiping at the feet of evil, and it was about to take more. That night, 3 fathers gathered, 3 broken men, united by grief and the unbearable truth. They sat at James Donnelly's kitchen table, firelight dancing across their lined faces, and shared everything they'd been too afraid to say aloud. Sean O'Connor, whose son Liam vanished last spring, described the sound that haunted his nights. Scratching beneath the floorboards, low murmurs, not quite words, echoing up from the churchyard. And on the darkest nights, he swore he saw shapes watching his home from across the road. Still, silent, waiting. Then there was Michael Walsh. His boy, Timothy, used to be the town chatterbox. Now, he barely spoke. When he did, it was in whispers, words that sounded like Latin but twisted like backwards prayers. Michael had found burn marks on his son's arms. When he asked about them, Timothy looked at him like a stranger and said, I'm being made ready. And James? He told them what Patrick saw, about the chambers beneath the basement, the rituals, the children who weren't children anymore. They didn't cry. They didn't sleep. They just waited for more. And Father O'Malley? He called it sacred transformation. He said Patrick was almost ready, that the sacred hunger would take them all. The three fathers sat in silence, whiskey untouched. One question on all their minds: what do we do now? Because if they stayed silent, more boys would disappear. But if they acted, they were going up against a man the entire town worshipped, a man who held their faith, their future, and their families in the palm of his hand. This wasn't just a priest anymore. This was a predator. And Sacred Heart was his hunting ground. You're a father. You've crossed an ocean. You clawed your way through famine, poverty, and prejudice, all to protect your child. But now, the greatest danger to your son is the priest you trusted with a soul. Welcome to the nightmare at Sacred Heart. Patrick Donnelly finally told his father what had been happening during those secret basement sessions. What he revealed was too disturbing to dismiss, even for men taught never to challenge authority. These weren't hot-headed rebels. These were working-class Irish immigrants, taught to keep their heads down, keep their faith strong, and avoid making enemies, especially with men in collars. But now, they were fathers, and the same instinct that had driven them across the Atlantic now screamed, "Your children are in mortal danger." So three men, James Donnelly, Sean O'Connor, and Michael Walsh, gathered at a kitchen table, voices low, hands trembling over glasses of whiskey. "We can't go to the sheriff," O'Connor said, glancing at the darkened windows. "He's Protestant. We bring this up, he'll laugh us out of town." "And the bishop?" Walsh shook his head. "Ollie's got letters with Kenrick's seal. Looks official enough. We accuse him without proof. We lose everything. Jobs, homes. Maybe the church tears our whole town apart just to cover it up." James Donnelly sat silently for a long moment, then raised his glass. His words burned hotter than the whiskey. "Then we get proof. The plan was reckless, dangerous, but necessary. They would surveil the church, spy on the man who held the entire town's trust. They'd go into the basement themselves, during the very nights when Patrick said the ceremonies took place. If they found nothing, they'd accept it, swallow their guilt, and move on. But if they were right, they'd bring down a monster in priest robes. Over the next weeks, they prepared like soldiers going to war. Oil lamps, notebooks, rations, Sean O'Connor's ancient hunting rifle, freshly cleaned. They took turns watching the church, tracking O'Malley's movements, waiting for the right night. But the deeper they looked, the more they uncovered, and what they found made their blood run cold. Timothy Walsh, Michael's son, wasn't just traumatized. He was physically changing. Dr. Klaus Brennan, an old German physician who treated Catholic families for decades, examined the boy and was deeply disturbed. Timothy's reflexes were sluggish. His eyes didn't respond to light. His body temperature? Too low to be normal. Dr. Brennan suspected poisoning, maybe exposure to some unknown toxin. But the scars on Timothy's arms and chest, those told a different story. Tiny, symmetrical, deliberate. What happened here? Brennan asked gently. The boy's answer? They're holy symbols. Father O'Malley carved them to protect me from demons. Carved with sterile precision, like a surgeon. Patrick Donnelly's case was even worse. He'd started listening to things, invisible things. He'd turn to empty corners and whisper replies, react to voices no one else could hear. O'Malley taught me how, Patrick said once, he says the saints speak to us, if we're ready. But not all the voices were kind. Some whispered of the hunger beneath. Some warned him of the cost of true communion. And then came the name that changed everything, the Ancient Shepherd. Patrick said the voices called it being older than Christ, one that learned to wear Christian symbols like a wolf in sheep's clothing. And Father O'Malley was its chosen voice. The boys who had disappeared, they hadn't left. They had changed, twisted into something that still lived beneath the church, serving a higher hunger. And Patrick? He was next. O'Malley says I'm ready, he whispered. He's been giving me special lessons. That was the breaking point. The fathers knew if they didn't act now, they'd lose their son forever. So they sharpened their plan, tightened their circle, lit the lamps, and chose a night. March 15, 1851. For days before the anniversary of Michael Flanagan's disappearance, the boy who started it all. This time, it would be O'Malley who was being watched. And the fathers, they were going into the darkness. They weren't just trying to uncover a predator. They were going to confront the devil in a collar. And what they would find that night would not only rip apart their church, it would change their lives and their faith forever. Something was terribly wrong. And now they had proof. Dr. Klaus Brennan, a seasoned German immigrant physician, had treated hundreds of rural Catholic children in the hills of Pennsylvania. But what he saw in Timothy Walsh made the blood drain from his face. The boy's reflexes, sluggish, his pupils, dilated even in sunlight, and his body temperature, too low to be human. Brennan considered poisoning, toxic exposure, maybe even parasitic infection. But then he saw the scars. Tiny, precise, intentional. They weren't from play or punishment. They were symbols, etched onto Timothy's chest and arms with surgical care. Not random, ritualistic. And when the doctor asked where they came from, Timothy calmly replied, "Father O'Malley made them during the blessings. They protect me from demons." The wounds were healing. Cleanly. No infection. Whoever had done this knew what they were doing. But the horror didn't stop there. Patrick Donnelly's case was worse. He wasn't just hearing things. He was listening, turning his head to empty corners, whispering answers to voices no one else could hear. When his father confronted him, Patrick didn't flinch. Instead, he said, "O'Malley taught me how to hear the saints." But even saints, Patrick warned, had dark cousins, because sometimes the voices weren't holy. Sometimes they whispered about something ancient, something that waited beneath the church. They called it the ancient shepherd, older than Christ, older than Rome, a being that wore Christian symbols like a wolf in sheep's clothing. And O'Malley, he was a mouthpiece. The missing altar boys? "They're not dead," Patrick said, eyes wide and unblinking. "But they're not alive either. Not really." He had seen them during true communion. Changed, eyes glowing in candlelight that burned the wrong color, mouths chanting in voices that didn't belong to children. He calls them his eternal altar boys. The horror was escalating. And now, 3 fathers were ready to fight back. If this story's already chilling your spine, you haven't seen anything yet. Share it with someone who needs to know the truth. And buckle up, because what happens next changes everything. March 15, 1851. For days before the anniversary of Michael Flanagan's disappearance, the night they would confront the evil that had taken root in St. Joseph's Church, 3 fathers, armed, terrified, determined, they split up under cover of darkness, blending into the wooded hills surrounding the church like hunters stalking a predator. Sean O'Connor hid behind the moss-covered mausoleum, eyes fixed on the church's front door, heart pounding like war drums. Michael Walsh crawled under the belfry, just beneath the basement windows Patrick had said sometimes glowed. James Donnelly held his son's journal in one hand, a lantern in the other, preparing to enter the belly of the beast. For 3 hours they waited. Silence. Only wind in the trees. Wolves howling in the far-off ridges. The hum of fear in their ears. Maybe they were wrong. Maybe they were chasing ghosts. Maybe this was grief twisting itself into paranoia. But then it happened. At exactly 2 a.m., the basement windows lit up. Not with candlelight. Not with fire. But with colors. Yellow. Then blue. Then red. And from inside came the sound. Chanting. But not in Latin. Not in any language these lifelong Catholics recognized. The tones were warped, inhuman, words that slithered into their ears and made their teeth ache, their eyes water, their thoughts blur. There was rhythm, a deep pulsing beat like a drum, but not made of animal skin. It sounded alive. Then came the children's voices, perfect harmony, sweet, innocent tones, singing lyrics that made Michael Walsh's skin crawl. Those weren't Christian hymns, he said later. Those were songs for something else, something old. He pressed closer to the window. The lights danced, shifting colors with no natural source. blood-red flickers, cold flashes of lightning white, sickly green flares that pulse like a heartbeat. And then the shadows moved. Something was inside. But the most horrifying moment belonged to James Donnelly. As he crept along the church's side wall, lantern low, he caught a glimpse through a narrow crack in the basement stone. And what he saw would scar him for life. James Donnelly never believed in monsters. Not until that night. He found the door exactly where Patrick had said it would be, a hidden entrance to the church basement that, according to old floor plans, shouldn't have even existed. But it was there. And worse, it was open, slightly ajar. From the crack flowed warm air, thick with the scent of incense, molten wax, and something else. Rot. It was the same smell James remembered from slaughter season, when pigs were butchered in the charnel house during harvest. Only this wasn't pork. This was something else. Something wrong. Something alive. James swallowed his fear and stepped inside. Stone steps descended into darkness. But the deeper he went, the brighter the glow became. Not firelight, not candlelight. Something else. Something unholy. And then he saw it. The basement of St. Joseph's Church, transformed into a temple of blasphemy. Every inch of the stone walls was carved. Not with scripture, but with symbols that writhed and twisted as the candlelight danced. They weren't decorations. They were living. The candles themselves were arranged in sickeningly perfect geometric patterns, like someone had studied sacred math from another world. Their flames bent backward, flickering in defiance of physics. And at the center, a black altar, one massive solid stone slab, polished to a mirrored shine, its surface slick with stains that James didn't dare identify. Then came the sound. Drums. Low, pulsing, organic, not skin-stretched drums. Something deeper, something alive. Encircling the altar, like some horrific parade, were 7 robed figures. At first James thought it was just a strange ritual, until he recognized their faces. Michael Flanagan, Tommy Sullivan, the other missing altar boys, the ones they said had gone to missionary schools. But they weren't gone. They were here, changed. Their eyes glowed in the dark like those of wild animals. Their bodies moved like clockwork, no hesitation, no humanity. And when they chanted, it wasn't one voice. It was many. One mouth, multiple voices, like a hive. And among them, James' heart shattered, was his own son. Patrick, still human barely, but falling fast. His movements were just a hair behind the others, like a puppet still half aware of its strings. And at the front of this unholy procession was Father Cornelius O'Malley. But the man James had once called a friend was gone. This thing wore O'Malley's skin, but moved with grace that bent human bone and muscle. His hands flowed like liquid, his voice layered like a chorus of ghosts, and his presence pressed down like a storm you could feel in your spine. This was no priest. This was a predator, ancient, cunning, and hungry. Then it happened. O'Malley raised his arms above the black altar and began chanting words older than any Bible. And the children began to sing. Not just notes, but songs from beneath the earth, sounds that reached into James' soul and tore it apart. It was beautiful and horrifying at the same time, like hearing angels scream. And just when James thought he couldn't take any more, his foot hit something. A candle. Crash. The sound shattered the ritual like a gunshot in a cathedral. And instantly, 7 pairs of eyes locked onto him. Eyes that used to belong to children. Now, predators. For a second, time froze. James couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He looked at the faces of boys he'd watched grow up, play in the mud, sing in choir, and saw nothing left inside them. Then O'Malley, or the thing inside him, spoke a single word in that language of the dead, and the altar boys advanced. Not walking, flowing. Their feet didn't step. They glided across the stone like liquid nightmares, and every movement echoed like bones snapping under weight. James ran like a man possessed, like a father escaping hell. Behind him came the sound, not footsteps, something worse. Scrapes, whispers, like graveyard wind crawling on hands and knees. He hit the outside air like a drowning man surfacing, lungs heaving, heart exploding. And right then, Sean O'Connor rounded the corner. His lantern beam hit James' face, pale, wild-eyed, and streaked with ashen tears. And James said 5 words that would ignite a fire that could never be put out. They're still in the church. James Donnelly was still catching his breath, but he wasn't alone anymore. Out of the darkness, O'Connor and Michael Walsh came sprinting from their hiding spots. Pale, panicked, shaken to the core. Both were babbling about figures moving through the cemetery. Figures that weren't quite human. Figures that didn't obey the laws of nature or God. The men didn't stop to talk. They ran. Through the trees. Through the cold. Through the kind of terror that lives in your bones. They didn't stop until the sun was up, and even then, they could barely speak. Try and make sense of the nightmare they had just witnessed. But the truth bomb was still 3 days away. When Bishop Francis Kendrick rolled into Sacred Heart with a wagon full of secrets, and a storm no one saw coming. Now here's the twist. The bishop wasn't there because of James or O'Connor or Walsh. None of them had spoken. They couldn't. Who would believe this? Instead, Kendrick had come after hearing whispers from other parishes, rumors, reports, missing altar boys, weird rituals, communities that shut down the moment someone started asking questions. And all of them had one thing in common: a priest with perfect credentials, a glowing reputation, and a name that sent chills down Kendrick's spine. Father Cornelius O'Malley. Only that wasn't his real name. The real Cornelius O'Malley died in a fire in Dublin in 1832. The man in Sacred Heart? A fraud. A ghost. A predator wearing a priest's face. Investigators tried to trace him. They couldn't. Everywhere they looked, the trail split like he'd lived a dozen different lives under a dozen different names. He was a master forgery, a manipulator of systems, a parasite with a PhD in spiritual deception. He'd slipped through Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia, leaving behind only 2 things: vanished children and churches scarred by silence. And now he had rooted himself in Sacred Heart for something bigger. On March 19th, 1851, 4 years to the day since Michael Flanagan disappeared, Kendrick made his move. He arrived at St. Joseph's with 2 priests, legal warrants, and authority from the highest levels of the church. He expected resistance, but what he walked into was a horror film wearing a crucifix. Inside the church, the congregation sat dead silent. Not a whisper, not a blink, just blank stares. Emotionless, hollow, gone. It wasn't faith. It was control. And at the pulpit, there he was, O'Malley, looking calm, composed, in command. He spoke Latin, but Kendrick could tell it wasn't Catholic Latin. The words twisted. They curled through the air like smoke and coiled in your brain like snakes. The responses from the congregation? Perfect. Unison. Too perfect. As if the entire town had memorized a script written by something inhuman. But it was the altar boys that truly broke the bishop's heart. 7 children, moving in sync. Every gesture identical, like they had been programmed. And their eyes, not normal, reflective, animalistic. When Kendrick asked to speak with them, they turned to him together, like predators locking eyes on prey. They approached as one, and when they answered, their voices layered, like one voice made from 7 throats. They spoke of joy, a divine service, of being chosen. But it wasn't devotion. It was indoctrination. Perfection designed to hide possession. Kendrick saw it. He knew. Something inside them had changed. Something biological. And something sacred had been perverted. So he made the demand. We need to inspect the basement. And in that moment, O'Malley broke. The illusion shattered. The mask he'd worn for years, across continents, under 100 fake names, slipped, and the monster underneath started to emerge. The moment the mask dropped, the nightmare became real. For years, he'd worn the costume of a priest, the robes, the voice, the piety, fooling entire towns. But now, Father O'Malley was gone, and what stood in his place? was something ancient, something hostile, something that should not exist. His eyes, once the calm blue of a trusted shepherd, turned black, bottomless, predatory. His voice dropped several octaves and split, speaking in tones that sounded like earth cracking open. And when he spoke, "You have no authority here." He grew, not in height, but in presence. He filled the room with a force that made everyone else feel small. "This ground was consecrated long before your carpenter god was even born. These children are mine by conquest. I will not surrender them to trembling little priests who fear what divinity truly demands." And then all hell broke loose. The battle didn't last long, but for those who survived, it felt like an eternity screaming through a keyhole. O'Malley moved faster than sight. His voice split into layers, each speaking in a different direction, chanting in languages that no human throat should know. The altar boys moved around him, in perfect formation, generating spirals of sound and light that shattered windows and burned symbols into the air. But Bishop Kendrick, he didn't flinch. He had come with something stronger than faith, stronger than silver, stronger than doctrine. He carried a ritual older than Rome, passed down by church inquisitors who'd fought things like this before. It wasn't an exorcism, it was a binding, a ritual not meant to cast demons out, but to strip them of disguise, to force them to reveal their true form. And when he performed it, the monster was unmasked. O'Malley's flesh melted like wax on fire. His bones twisted, snapped, realigned in patterns that obeyed no anatomy chart. Eyes opened, not just on his face, but across his entire body, on his neck, on his hands, on his back. Each one stared into a different world. His skin turned translucent, glowing from the inside, revealing a nervous system of black veins pulsing like drum beats. And when he screamed, every window in the church shattered. 3 priests collapsed to their knees, blood pouring from their ears. But the worst came next. The altar boys, all 7, collapsed at once. Their bodies convulsed as the creature's hold was broken. When it ended, 5 were dead, eyes open, empty, gone. But 2 screamed, real screams, child screams. For the first time in months, they sounded like boys again. Patrick Donnelly was one of them. His father, James, no longer held by the fog of O'Malley's manipulation, scooped him up and ran. Behind him, the congregation stirred, as if waking from a years-long nightmare. They began to flee, one by one, parents, children, running from their church like it was a burning building. And inside, the creature's screams echoed to the hills of Pennsylvania, the sound of damnation being denied at harvest. The Vatican sealed everything. The official report on what happened at St. Joseph's Church on March 19, 1851, locked in a vault for nearly 150 years. Only in 1998, when the church began confronting its darker past, did the truth come to light. The documents revealed the truth. The false father O'Malley was not alone. There were others, entities, not demons, not ghosts, something else. Things that had learned to wear the skins of priests, to speak the language of faith, to weaponize trust. Kendrick's final report said it plainly. A non-human intelligence, malevolent in purpose, capable of long-term infiltration through religious structures and psychological manipulation of isolated communities. And its most terrifying tactic? Using the church itself. The robes, the rituals, the blind obedience. To access children, to silence doubt, to turn sanctuary into slaughterhouse. And if O'Malley was one, how many more were still out there? If this story chilled you to the bone, imagine what else lies hidden in the Vatican's vaults. Like, share, subscribe, because next time, we're opening another sealed file, another hidden chapter, another truth they never wanted you to hear. Welcome to Dark Communion. And we're just getting started. Of 7 small robes, freshly laid out in a circle around a black stone altar that hadn't been listed in any original inventory. The robes matched those worn by the missing altar boys from 1851, But these weren't century-old relics. They were new, the fabric unrotted, the symbols embroidered in thread that shimmered under the flashlight beams like something alive. And in the center of the altar was a journal, bound and worn, hand-stitched leather, its first page, blank, except for a single sentence. The hunger never left. This discovery sent a wave of panic through the historical team. The county halted construction immediately. The Catholic diocese was contacted, but within 48 hours, 2 men from Rome arrived, took possession of the robes, the journal, the altar itself, and sealed all further findings under ecclesiastical authority. The official explanation? An unrelated historical anomaly, pagan graffiti from pre-settlement rituals, mistakenly linked to urban legend. But the workers who had found the basement said otherwise. They reported missing time. They spoke of cold pockets of air that move against the laws of thermodynamics. Some claimed to hear chanting from below even after the site had been cleared, and one man, the site foreman, quit construction permanently, telling reporters, that wasn't just a church basement, it was a mouth, and we woke it up. The church may have been demolished, the basement may have been filled, but in communities across the Midwest, whispers still surface of priests who speak too many languages, of symbols appearing beneath altars overnight, of children who wake up changed, eyes dark, voices layered, dreams full of stone chambers and endless hunger. The creature that wore Father O'Malley's face, it was never caught, never named, and possibly never alone, because Sacred Heart wasn't the beginning, and it wouldn't be the end. If this story made your skin crawl and your pulse race, share it with someone who dares to look beneath the surface. Because every church has a basement, but not every basement stays buried. Like, subscribe to, and stay with us. Because next time, we're digging into another forgotten file the church never wanted you to read. Until then, keep your faith close, and your doubts even closer. What they unearthed beneath the courthouse wasn't just history. It was a crime scene, one that had waited nearly a century to be discovered. Scattered around the old stone altar, the construction crew found personal items, toys, rosaries, shoes, even lockets, each one belonging to a child reported missing over the past 10 years. They weren't simply abandoned. They had been arranged in chilling ritual patterns around the altar. The stones were stained with substances that resisted all chemical analysis. Not blood, not wax, something else. And then came the worst discovery. 14 small skeletons, buried beneath the floor, not haphazardly, but in geometric patterns, encircling a central chamber marked by centuries of ceremonial use. Dr. Margaret Thornton, a respected forensic anthropologist, was brought in. Her findings were devastating. The bones belonged to children between 8 and 16 years old, and while some were over 100 years old, the most recent remains were less than 5 years old, which meant whatever happened in 1851 hadn't ended, it had continued. Long after the church was sealed, long after the Vatican claimed it was over, the bones were quietly reburied. A Christian ceremony was held in the new Sacred Heart Cemetery. But those who handled the remains reported terrifying dreams for months. Children singing Latin hymns from underground. Shadows moving independently from their sources. Whispers in empty rooms. Some construction workers quit entirely. Others refused to return to night shifts, swearing they could hear footsteps and chanting from beneath the foundation. The courthouse was completed in 1924. Despite the warnings, but it was never normal. In its 80 years of operation, employees reported higher than average mental breakdowns, cases of mysterious illnesses that doctors couldn't diagnose. Turnover so frequent it became a local joke. Then, in 2003, the building was abandoned. Engineers cited unexplained structural decay. No one could fix it. It sat empty for 2 decades until renovation crews found something else. A lead line box buried deep within the foundation. Inside, Bishop Kendrick's sealed records. A truth hidden for over 150 years, a warning buried by the church, and a final record of an entity that had infiltrated faith itself. This story teaches us a painful truth. Evil doesn't always come with horns and flames. Sometimes it wears a collar. Sometimes it speaks in scripture. Sometimes it calls itself Father. The 14 altar boys of St. Joseph's weren't just taken. They were betrayed, not just by one creature, but by a system that refused a question, that protected power over innocence. Their voices were stolen, their bodies used in ways too horrifying to describe, and the people meant to protect them looked away. But now, you've heard their story, and stories have power. So we ask you, what do you believe happened to the entity that called itself Father Wamali? Was it truly destroyed? Or is it still out there, wearing a new face in another forgotten town? And more importantly, have you ever felt uneasy when someone in power demanded your silence? Let us know in the comments. Share your story, because the more we speak out, the less darkness has to hide in. If this tale chilled your soul, subscribe to uncover more horrors buried beneath American history. Like the video to support independent storytelling, and share it with someone who loves mysteries that the world tried to forget. We'll see you next time. And next time, the darkness gets deeper.